Another time, Jesus went into the synagogue, and a man with a shriveled hand was there. Some of them were looking for a reason to accuse Jesus, so they watched him closely to see if he would heal on the Sabbath. Jesus said to the man with the shriveled hand, "Stand up in front of everyone." Then Jesus asked them, "Which is lawful on the Sabbath? To do good or to do evil? To save life or kill?" But they remained silent. He looked around at them in anger and, deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts, said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. Then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. When we look at Mark's gospel, and we've spent quite a bit of time here in the last several weeks, but when we look at Mark's gospel, Mark, it seems to always bring about or identify these confrontations that Jesus has. So the verses preceding this in chapter 2, Jesus and his disciples are walking through the field. And his disciples, as they're walking through the field, a grain field, they kind of pick some grain. And the religious leaders looked at that as a form of work. So they start asking, "Hey, why are your disciples violating the Sabbath?" And so there is this dialogue that Jesus has with them in chapter 2. And Mark takes us from that incident immediately into the next, in chapter 3, to this story. And the issue today is about the Sabbath and the violation of the Sabbath day. Through this confrontation, what Jesus is going to do, he's going to cut across the man-made rules and regulations that was established by the religious leaders. He's going to cut across that. And he's going to get directly into the heart of the issue, which is bringing our focus back onto the purpose of the Sabbath. So one of the reasons that he always, not one of them, I believe there are about 8 or 9 incidences that's recorded in the gospel of Jesus healing on the Sabbath. And each time he does that, he wants the religious leaders to see the hypocrisy in which they live. He wants to restore the Sabbath back to what? The freedom to express and to love and worship and rest, rather than be bogged down by the weight, all of the regulations and the rules that were established by the religious leaders. I want to just kind of go through each of the verses a little bit today. And at the end, I want to draw a little bit of perhaps an application for us. Jesus, at the beginning of this passage in chapter 3, Mark tells us that Jesus went into a synagogue. Anyone know what a synagogue is? You nodded. What is a synagogue? Anyone? Okay. Oh, that's a very good answer. Jewish church. It was a place of worship, much like our modern day church today. It's a place that people would go, right? It's a place that they would go to worship, to pray, and to receive instruction. It was also common in the synagogue for young Jewish boys to be taught, instructed at school, perhaps. That is the synagogue. It's a common place that Jesus would go. In fact, he went very often. Apostle Paul, when he starts doing his missions, what does he do? He always goes to the synagogue. And he went there and he started interacting with people, the Jews that were spread out throughout the region. So today, we see that Jesus visits a synagogue, which is nothing out of the ordinary. And when he gets into this synagogue, there are 2 groups of people that are waiting for him. One are the Jews, who would normally gather to worship, to receive teaching. And among that group, Mark identifies a man with a shriveled hand, a deformed hand. The second group are the Pharisees, the religious leaders. Once again, their presence in the synagogue is nothing new. It's nothing out of the ordinary. They would be expected to be there as well. Sometimes Jesus, as he goes into the synagogue, he's given the opportunity to teach. When there was no teacher, one of the Pharisees would definitely be there to teach. But because Jesus and Paul, as he's traveling, they're kind of the special guests, they're allowed to teach. And we see that happening in the life and ministry of Paul as well. As Jesus comes into the synagogue, he notices a man. And in verse 3, he says to him, stand up in front of everyone. When he interacts and when he identifies this man, what it shows to me at least is that he's already prepared to take action about the situation. He knows it's a Sabbath. He knows what the rules are in terms of what the religious leaders had established. He knows what their rules were. Yet it seems like he was determined already that he's going to do something about this man. When Jesus asked him to stand up, this man, he stood. So this kind of shows me a little bit about him. This man had a disability. He had a shriveled hand, meaning maybe he didn't have some of the limbs or some of the fingers, maybe his hands, something, it was definitely deformed. How did it happen? We're not told. But in a time period, in Jesus' time, often Jesus' disciples even ask him, why did this man, there was a man that was born, I think, blind. Why does this man, why is this man in this situation? Disciples ask him, is it his sin or sins of his parents? The Jewish style was that your condition was directly related to a sin. In an era when disabilities and sicknesses were directly associated with some kind of a sin, in an era where there's a certain stigma associated with disability and sicknesses, the last thing this guy wanted to do was to be called out, to stand in front of the group of people. But the fact that he didn't object and he stood up, it shows something about him. So I wonder what's going on in his mind. Did he have some kind of a hope? Did he have some faith that something amazing would happen on this day? You see, someone in that situation, they don't want to stand out in the crowd. They want to blend into the crowd. The last thing they want is attention drawn to them. They want to fit. He just wanted to come and worship. And yet, he's asked to stand. And he does. What did he expect? Did he demonstrate some form of faith? That if he obeyed Jesus' commands, that he could be healed. The scene that Mark portrays here is that the people are there, disciples, they're there with Jesus. The Pharisees are there. This man is there. And he is standing up in the middle. It's like me right now telling one of you guys to stand up. Imagine how you would feel. Should we try that? You would just kind of freeze a little bit, right? Well, this is the guy. He's standing, and there's a silence. What seems like an eternity, there's a silence. And he's kind of looking around. People are looking at him. They're like, oh, yes, I remember him. John. And in that moment, you can see the anticipation of the crowd, of the worshipers, is beginning to build. What's going to happen? Why did Jesus ask this guy to stand up? Jesus draws everyone's attention to this man, and people are watching closely. Verse 2, we're told that the Pharisees are also watching closely, but they're watching for the completely opposite reason. I believe that the worshipers are watching to see in anticipation what Jesus would do. Would he heal? And how would he heal? I think that's where they're coming from. The Pharisees, they're watching to find a fault. They're watching him closely so that they can find a reason to accuse him. Accuse him of what? Being a Sabbath violator. By healing on the Sabbath. It's clear that verse 2 tells us that the Pharisees had already turned against Jesus. They come with an ulterior motive. They come with this look of seeing, watching his every move. to identify something that they can use against him, something that they can bring a charge against him. Would he heal on the Sabbath? They already knew the answer to that question, I think. Of course he would. That's why they're watching him so closely. The Pharisees are the religious leaders of the time. And in their interpretation of the Sabbath, they said, you can heal on the Sabbath. It's okay if the person's life was in danger. So in their view, in their mind, a man with a shriveled hand, his life is not in danger. Therefore, it's a violation to heal on the Sabbath. You can wait until the next day. All Jesus has to do is wait until the next day, come and find him, and heal him. And the Pharisees will be happy. According to Exodus, Exodus chapter 31, verse 14. This is what the Bible tells. This is what God says about the Sabbath. He says, observe the Sabbath, because it is holy to you. Anyone who desecrates it is to be put to death. Those who do any work on that day must be cut off from your people. See, they wanted to see, will Jesus heal on the Sabbath? And if he does, we will consider that to be a violation of the Sabbath. And as a violation of the Sabbath, Mosaic law says he is to be put to death. That is why they're watching him so closely. You know, Sabbath day observance, as we read in Exodus 31, it was very serious. And it's the reason that the religious leaders got carried away with so many regulations and rules. They did not want to violate and be put to death. So they said, what is work? And then they began to define that. They did not want to face this consequence. In verse 4, Jesus asked him, as after he has the guy stand up, he asked him, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save life or to kill? That's the question that he throws out. Another long silence. I want to look at two passages in Luke's gospel. Luke chapter 13, verse 15. The Lord answered him, you hypocrites, doesn't each of you on the Sabbath untie your ox or donkey from the stall and lead it out to give it water? Luke 14, verse 5. Then he asked him, if one of you has a child or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull it out? What is Jesus doing here in these two verses? Jesus is calling out the Jews who would water their animals, who would help their animals out of a ditch on the Sabbath. It's almost as if they had more love for animals than human beings who were sick, who were afflicted. It's okay to take care of their animals because, oh Lord, we don't want them to die of thirst on the Sabbath, so we can take them. We should take them. Take them to the pasture. Let them drink water. And on the way, if it falls, I have to pull him out. But to heal a person afflicted on the Sabbath, God forbid that. That's the hypocrisy that Jesus is calling out. He's saying, which is better? Which is more consistent? To heal, to do good, to save life, or to kill, or to do evil? Which is more consistent with the purpose of the Sabbath? It's okay to save an animal if it falls into a ditch, but it's not okay to save someone from an illness on the Sabbath. That's the question that Jesus is kind of throwing back at the religious leaders. He's specifically speaking to them, I believe, here. When Jesus asks in verse 4, which is it, which is better to do evil or to do good? to save life or to kill. The obvious answer to that is to do good, to save. That is lawful on the Sabbath. That is better on the Sabbath. And one of the commentators says this: Jesus is showing that the Sabbath is a day to love God and to love and serve your fellow man by doing good to your neighbor. Religion, you see, to the Jewish religious leaders, it was a ritual, obeying rules and regulations. That's what Sabbath has become. And in large part, that's what their religion has become. And that is what Jesus came to speak against. And he's using this opportunity in Mark chapter 3 to get them away from all of the rules and regulations and lift their heads up to God. Because the Sabbath was a day that is intended to honor, to rest, worship. What Jesus is basically saying here is that the failure to do good on the Sabbath day by healing, the failure of doing that was to do evil. Failure to meet this man's needs, he's equating that to the evil. The irony is that the religious leaders, they violated God's law by plotting murder. And when you look at verse 6, they go out and they plot with the Herodians about how they might kill Jesus. Here they accuse Jesus of violating the Sabbath. But the irony is that by plotting murder, they violate God's law. Do not murder. You know, God instituted the Sabbath in Israel to give his people a day of rest in which they could focus on him. It was a day to honor and delight in him. But the rules and the regulations that were established by these leaders, it put a huge burden on the people. How do you define work? I'm working on the Sabbath. I'm in violation. You should all take me out and stone me. How are we going to violate, or how are we going to define work? These rules and regulations, I guarantee you and I, we cannot possibly meet and keep the rules and regulations that the Pharisees had laid out. It is impossible. It's impossible. Elder Shim drives from Salem. He violated it. He can go 1 mile. You can go 1 mile, but that's it. What? Okay, that was walking. How about in the car? Maybe with 10 miles. They wanted to define. Why? Once again, we go back to Exodus 31. The violation, the results of violating the Sabbath are serious. Death. So because of that, these rules and regulations were in place. But they became a burden. Heavy burden on the shoulders of all the people. There are so many regulations that you cannot keep track of them all. And the true character of the day was lost among these rules and regulations. The last thing the religious leaders wanted to do was violate the Sabbath. It was this desire that actually clouded their eyes, and they objected to this healing and ultimately to Jesus by plotting murder. They could not see beyond the violation because they had already determined that Jesus was a threat to everything that they had worked for. The system that they had in place, Jesus came and he was a threat. So when Jesus says, which is better to do? What is lawful on the Sabbath? And he asked that question in verse 4. There was silence. The religious leaders did not answer the question. They could not answer the question. Because if they answered, you see, they were trying to trap Jesus, but they themselves got trapped. If they answered, to do good, then why can't Jesus heal? They're not going to say Sabbath, you have to do evil. I mean, they're not going to answer that way. So they remained silent. They could not answer. Verse 5, he looked around at them in anger and deeply distressed at their stubborn hearts. This word looked around in the Greek, it means this penetrating look. It's this look, you and I, we have all received this look. Sometimes it's from our spouses. Sometimes it's from a teacher. Sometimes it's from a parent. And it's this look, you know when that look comes, you are in trouble. It's a look that requires no verbal communication because the look communicates everything. I try to use it on my kids. It doesn't work. Kids these days, they're not afraid. My daughter just laughs. And I'm just like, what do I do? It's this penetrating look. And we're told in verse 5 that he looked at them in anger. I don't know, that might surprise you to read that Jesus got angry. In anger, you and I, we sometimes we get angry, we get out of control. And in that sense, when we get out of control, thoughts come into our minds, words come out of our mouth, actions happen where we might sin. But in Jesus, we know that he didn't sin. So it's possible to get angry without sin. It's possible. It's a struggle. It's a struggle. It's difficult. But Jesus got angry. And he was deeply saddened. He was angry with them, I think, for one reason. It was their hardened hearts, as we're told. Stubborn hearts. It was the refusal to acknowledge that Sabbath day, you can. Sabbath day was a day to do good. It was their refusal to answer that question. Which is lawful to do on the Sabbath? Good or evil? Save or kill? They remained silent. Because in their mind, they had already determined what? These are the rules of the Sabbath. And you must keep these rules. And anything outside of that is a violation. They were more concerned about following their regulations. And I use the word their regulations as these were not God's regulations. They were more concerned about following their regulations. They thought that they were keeping the Sabbath day holy. That's all that they cared about. Stretch out your hands. He stretched it out, and his hand was completely restored. One interesting thing here is that Jesus didn't really do anything to convey work. It was just simple commands. And he healed through just a simple command. So the religious leaders, they could not come to him and say, you violated the Sabbath by working. That's not the angle that Jesus allows them to come. He allows them only to come. You healed on the Sabbath. And among all the people, healing on the Sabbath, that's a great thing, isn't it? See, he is eliminating the work angle here. And he's simply saying, stretch out your hand. He stretches his hand. And he is restored. Simple following his simple verbal commands. Verse 6, then the Pharisees went out and began to plot with the Herodians how they might kill Jesus. You know, Jesus was a threat to them. They had seen enough. They had all the evidence they needed. Jesus needed to be dealt with. They walked out and joined forces with the Herodians to kill Jesus. And so who are these guys? The Herodians, they were a Jewish political party, political group. They had one agenda. From a political standpoint, who in this time, in Mark's gospel, in this time, who controlled Jerusalem? It was the Romans. They were in power. The Herodians, their goal was to get King Herod's line onto the throne. Their goal was a political overthrow of the Roman Empire. So they were coming from more of a political position. The Pharisees and the Herodians, they didn't like each other. In fact, they hated each other. They were rivals. Yet here, we see them coming together, cooperating, working together to eliminate a common threat. Two rivals plotting murder because Jesus was a common enemy. You know, we see this happen in history, and it's happening even now. Right now, ISIS is an evil empire, you know, evil force. And these people who normally fight against each other are coming together and fighting them in certain parts of Syria and Iraq. So we see that happening. When you see a common enemy, it doesn't matter what your relationship is. If there's a threat that's greater than both of you guys, or threat that's to both of you, you will come together and to address that threat. And that's what's happening here. The Pharisees and the Herodians working together. That is an amazing thing. How does this apply to us today? In Mark chapter 2, verse 27 and 28, this is the end of chapter 2. Jesus says this: "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." You know, when I was in high school, during the school year, I had a really hard time getting a job. Summertime, you know, I had a pretty easy time getting a job, and I worked every summer in high school. But during the school year, I had a really difficult time. And the reason is, as a student, Monday through Friday, you know, you go to school and homework or whatever. Saturday and Sunday would be the 2 days that you have available to work. In my application, when I'm filling out the application, they used to ask a question: are there any days you cannot work? So I would X out Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and Sunday. So on my application, a manager would look at that and say, "This guy can work 1 day a week." Next. That's how I filled up the application. And the reason is, my parents had ingrained in my mind all throughout my life to that point: you don't work on Sunday. You do not work on Sunday. Sunday is the Sabbath. It is a day of rest. It's a day for us to go to worship. It's a day for us to spend time as a family. You do not work on Sunday. So I naturally filled out my application, said I'm available on Saturday, so I'm ready to go. I didn't get a job. My parents taught me the value, I think, of the Sabbath day when I was young. Sabbath was given to us. As Jesus says, Sabbath was made for man. It was given to us. It was a day that was intended for us to delight in Him, to honor Him, to worship Him, to rest in Him. So the question I have for us this morning as we reflect on that is, how are we doing in this regard? Do you have a day to rest and reflect on God? How are you using your Sabbath day? In modern day Christianity, in our evangelical circles, we used Sunday has become the Sabbath day. Traditionally in the scriptures, as well as some of the Orthodox Jews today in modern day, they believe Friday sundown, Saturday sundown, that 24-hour period, that's their day of observance. For us, Sunday is this day that we call the Sabbath. How is Sabbath used? Sabbath has become a day to rest, attend church in the morning, followed by football, grocery shopping, taking care of all the errands that we couldn't run Monday through Friday. The Sabbath day has become just another day, a day actually to catch up. Sometimes catch up on the sleep that you missed out on. I'm not saying those are bad things. Don't get me wrong. But I'm saying, as our approach to the Sabbath day, how do we approach this day? Do we approach the Sabbath as a day of rest, a day to honor and delight in Him? Or is it a weekend and we just can't wait to do whatever we want to do on the weekend? You know, Jesus is bringing the focus of the Sabbath back to its original, I think, purpose. Jesus chose to do good on the Sabbath. He didn't care about the man-made regulations and the rules. And naturally, you know, for me, Sunday is quote-unquote a work day. You know, most pastors, people in ministry, is that way. You know, there are people in church who serve throughout the church, and many of you guys teach in children's ministry and youth as well. You guys work Monday through Friday. You come to church, you worship, and then you serve. So sometimes Sunday may not feel like a Sabbath day as well. What I used to do is spend a half day. I was so, and this is no excuse, but I was so busy that I couldn't even take a full day. It was not possible. So I used to try to cut off a half a day on Monday morning, where I would just, wake up, take my kids to the daycares, and come home and just rest until at least past lunchtime. That's what I try to do, because there's a value in that. There's a value in having this time of rest and reflection, a time that we set aside to reflect, to pray, and rest in the Lord. You and I, we need a break from this busy life and the busy schedule that we live. We need to take a break from that and spend some quality time with God. My prayer for us this morning, as we read through this passage and as we looked at what's going on here, and as we see what Jesus is doing, is to restore the focus of the Sabbath day back on to its original purpose, which is a day of rest, which is a day to pray, which is a day to do good, which is a day to honor God. It's a day to delight in God. If you can't do it on Sunday, you gotta have a time where you designate it, because the Sabbath was made for us to do that. God put that into schedule so that we would spend time with Him.